Now, I do have a few graphs in my presentation, but I will emphasise that this isn't a research presentation. You might think of it more as an op-ed or as an opinion piece, or as the heading says, a writer perspective. So it's based on facts, an interpretation of the facts, maybe some views and thoughts, and perhaps some unanswered questions. There are many people in this room that have got more technical expertise and experience in varying elements of motorcycle safety than I've got. But my aim here this morning is that each of you will find out at least one thing that you didn't know already, and that perhaps you might go away thinking of something about, I hadn't considered it from that perspective. So let's talk about my organisation. So established in 1980, I might start actually asking, the question's sort of been floated but it hasn't actually been answered. You can find out who in the room has actually got a motorcycle licence. You'd raise your hand if you would. Now, hopefully, keep your hands raised. Hopefully my second question, no extra hands go up, because the next question is, who has either got access or owns a motorcycle and would consider themselves to be a regular rider? Still? Quite a few. Okay, thanks. So at the Australian Motorcycle Council, we don't claim to represent Australian riders. And you'll hear in a moment how many people we're talking about there. But by the very nature of our organisation, which is made up of the rider groups from all of the 8 states and territories, we often represent the interests of Australian riders in the media, at conferences and events such as that. And that's not to say our view is a common view. Motorcycling is a disparate group. Even within the confines of the Australian Motorcycle Council, there are people with differing views. And I dare say, I'm certain, that there'll be motorcycle riders in this room today who will disagree and perhaps challenge some of the things that I say. So as I said, I'm here as the chair of the organisation to present a perspective and talking with a focus on the safe system. So I've probably touched on this introduction, so I won't dwell on this any further about the aims of our organisation, but we're particular about advocating for motorcycling as a transport mode, and then working on motorcycle safety within that. Because historically, say up until 20 years ago, a lot of the discussions about motorcycling and when the motorcycle safety strategies first started to develop, the focus was purely on motorcycling from the safety perspective. I've got a little graph I'm going to just quickly talk through now about numbers, if this one comes up. So why don't I put this graph up, and this won't be surprising to many of you, but I just want to dwell on it. There had been a bit of a focus, say 20 or more years ago, where people would say, you know, the best answer to motorcycle safety is if we could get less people to ride motorcycles. But I just want to put this up in case, hopefully not, if there's anyone in the room who might have wondered about that or sort of questioned that. I'll also demonstrate in a moment with some figures about why that's not a successful strategy in any event. But let's just say, for the purpose of numbers, very simple numbers and maths, that we had 1,000 people riding, and in each year 10 of them are killed in fatal crashes, or 1%. So through some various strategies, we come up with, and I'll highlight one. So there was a national road safety strategy around about 15 years ago, that one of the specific elements of the motorcycle strategy was to promote the use of public transport. Now, use of public transport might be great from an overall transport system perspective, but trying to get motorcycle riders to swap to public transport is not a motorcycle safety initiative. Because if you were successful in achieving a 10% reduction in riders, so in the following year, only 900 people were riding motorcycles, nothing else changed in your safety system, so 1% of those riders died, so you had 9 people die the following year. Some people might say, that's wonderful, the number's gone from 10 to 9, we've achieved a 10% reduction in motorcycle fatalities. But of course, the simple answer is, for those that are still riding, you haven't changed anything. The fatality rate would still be 1%. So even if you were able to achieve a modal shift, as it's described, for those who, for a whole range of varying reasons, continue to ride, that hasn't done anything about their safety. I'm just going to do a quick introduction. It's funny, a couple of other speakers have spoken about their history in motorcycling, so it's just by coincidence maybe that mine is as well. This is a long time ago. So I have in fact been riding since my 16th birthday. Talk about family. So I don't come from a family background of motorsport or petrol head people, to use that description. But I've been very interested in motorcycles from when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And when I was about 15, the family discussion around the dinner table started around the fact that Sean wanted to take up motorcycling. My father and my siblings, of which I was the youngest, so my elder siblings, none of them rode, were aghast at the idea. But my mother said about 15-year-old Sean, well, Sean's a pretty smart kid. If he wants to ride a motorbike, I'm sure he'll look after himself. So this picture, just a notation on this, interesting. So I did live in Tasmania until 10 years ago. I live in Victoria these days. Now down in Tasmania where the weather's a little bit colder, wearing full leathers is not unusual. This picture's more than 40 years ago. In fact, I remember the first year I came to Bathurst to the Easter motorcycle races as an 18-year-old. I was surprised to see all these people who'd ridden to Bathurst from all over New South Wales and from Queensland wearing denim jeans and leather jackets. And I'm thinking, where are the motorcycle riders wearing full leathers like everybody in Tasmania does? Interesting. Okay, so just some context of where we've come to. Just a quick bit of a journey in motorcycle safety in Australia. Now, this isn't by all means everything. It's just a couple of points to highlight. So there was a recommendation from a federal government inquiry in 2003 that a national motorcycle safety strategy be developed. That never happened. From the mid-2000s, significant increase in motorcycle usage, and I've got a graph in a moment that will show that. At the same time, from the mid-2000s, as the increase was happening in motorcycle numbers in Australia, this was happening across the Western world also, so in the USA and all across Europe. And that was what led the OECD to convene this Motorcycle Safety Summit in Norway in 2008. It was held the same year as the Motorcycle and Scooter Safety Summit in Canberra. In fact, how many people here were at that summit in Canberra in 2008? Not many, but a few. When we met in Norway in 2008, it was a focus largely on motorcycling in the Western world under the umbrella of the OECD, and the global fleet at that stage was estimated at around about 300 million. In a moment I'll let you know how many motorcycles are registered on the roads and in the world these days. The Australia's infrastructure guide, which was mentioned as well, and I'll touch on that in the Safe System of Infrastructure, and our two current documents at a federal level, the National Road Safety Strategy and the Current Action Plan. And I must say, one of the great things in the Current Action Plan, which differs from all the previous ones, is the fact that it talks about things that the Commonwealth are going to do and the things that each of the states and territories are going to do. So it's great to have had the ministers across the state and territory level make that sort of commitment to the National Road Safety Strategy. Now this is a report on the Canberra Summit. It is 2008, a long time ago, 17 years I know. But if you're interested in sort of some background and history, it's worth actually digging in and having a read. There were 7 key outcome areas that were focused on from that summit, and really each of those in our current talking fits within one of the elements of the safe system. So I've got some graphs here. So these are motorcycle registrations in Australia going back to 1990. So you'll see that when the summit was convened in 2008, there'd been this sort of slight increase. But in the following years since, so in the 2010s, if that's the right expression, a significant increase, then levelling out a bit, and then a slight increase in the couple of years post-COVID. So registration data is up to 2023. My next slide is, this is the national picture, not the New South Wales picture, the national picture. So this is the total number of motorcycle fatalities in Australia over the past 35 years. The alarming thing for me is, of course, that after years of up and down, slight spikes, but really kind of flatlined almost over a period of 20, 30 years, that in the 4 years since COVID, there's been an increase every year. Now, there's another period earlier on where there'd been an increase in 3 years. This is now 4 years. Any of you who were at the Australasian Road Safety Conference in Hobart in October last year would have heard Dr. Ingrid Johnson from the College of Road Safety highlight that, in fact, so this is a similar trend with all road users for the country, and that this increase, then she only had the figures obviously of 2023, that this is in fact the first time in over 50 years that there's been a four-year increase in motorcycle deaths in Australia. And that total last year of 278, as you can see from the graph, is also the highest single figure in the past 35 years. Now, as was touched on by Bernard and also by Josh, now there has been a significant increase, and really, the rate of fatalities had been improving. And that's what my next slide is going to show. I just wanted to point out too, as with Bernard, my graphs are purposely bar graphs and not lines, because for me, each single increment in every single year that on my slide represents a person. And many of you, I do, know the people who make up those numbers. So for me, a total of road deaths isn't a single line death. It's always a bar graph. Now let's look at the motorcycle fatality rate. So you see that over that 35-year period, again, with some ups and downs, but kind of been in a constant state of decline. As also Bernard alluded to, prior to 1990, so that wasn't the peak. If my graph went back another 20 years, and I've actually got the figures on my spreadsheet, not quite back to 1970, but nearly, the fatality rate in the 70s and the 80s was far worse than that. So 1990, where this graph starts, was the downward point, and it's continued downwards over the last 30 years. We don't have the total registrations for 2024. That data's not available. But knowing that the number for 2024 of deaths, 278, was the highest in 35 years, definitely the next step on that graph is going to be a slight tick up for 2024 as well. So it is an alarming situation that, again, after so many years of improvement, 3 or 4 years of flatline, that dip during 2020 for COVID, but the last 3 or 4 years, something's changed. And none of us know what it is. That's the challenge as well. So let's move on to the safe system. And some people sort of say, they have this question about, how does motorcycling, where does that all fit in the safe system? And the safe system, that's all a bit strange, and is it outdated, and is it right, is it wrong? So my background, other than motorcycle safety, I've been involved for about 20 years, but I've also worked in the OC health and safety or work health and safety space, whichever you like to call it. And in workplace safety, we're talking about trained and safe people doing tasks in a safe environment, properly maintained equipment, looking for continuous improvement, and indeed overseen by a regulatory environment. So in fact, the application to road safety is similar, you might say, to that. So here, and I'm going to touch on the fifth element. So sometimes the post-crash care isn't always sort of represented in a graph, but I'm going to talk about the 5 elements of the safe system. So detection systems, there's been a lot of advance in vehicle technology, but it's still coming about. When there used to be 2 road safety conferences, at the 2013 College Road Safety Conference in Adelaide, that is nearly 12 years ago, it was presented that ITS was the next silver bullet for road safety. And I said there, and others did too, it's a long way from being perfected. And meanwhile, in Australia, 1,200 or 1,300 people are dying a day, and globally 1.2 million. So certainly the work that's happening is important, but there is a long way to go. Now, I haven't been fortunate enough yet to get to Cuddle, but last year I was at the Florida Department of Transport's new test facility called SunTrax in Orlando. And this is where these pictures are from. And again, I'm not taking the picture up to sort of to ridicule or make fun of the program, but this was a testing of the motorcycle detection system on the BMW. In this particular test, it failed. So there's still a lot of it. Current model, brand new, high-tech vehicle, but still a long way to go. The vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So again, the warnings about approaching to crossroads is indicated here in this image from Bosch. And I've got some summary points across all things in vehicles. So there are things happening in terms of automatic braking. It's interesting, when you talk about motorcycle safety in the safe system, a lot of people think, it's ABS, protective clothing, making sure you've got motorcycle underrun, and having police enforcement. But there are way more elements to the safe system for motorcycling. So different detection systems, so vehicle to vehicle, we talked about driver fatigue. And then for motorcycles in particular, so ABS by no means new, but developments coming in cornering ABS, that is the ABS systems that work when a motorcycle is leaned over, and coming displays in heads-up display, so that riders have got information displayed on their visor and their helmet rather than looking down. Speed. Now, look, I'm not going to speak a lot on the speed. I'll go through this one. I just took these pictures in Victoria only recently. Even within the motorcycling community, and some motorcycle people would know this, there are a lot of people in the motorcycle community don't actually accept the fact that the higher the speed you're going at, the more likely you are to crash. There's many studies that have found that to be the case. So there's some challenges in terms of the understanding of speed in the motorcycle community in particular. I've just sort of highlighted here, and again, I'm not going to go into speed in a lot of detail, and again, this is just a touch on opinion piece, not a technical assessment of speed, but just some things to consider. So the speed, particularly about the location, and Byrne did acknowledge that speed-related motorcycle crashes are largely not about people doing 120 kilometres an hour on a 100 kilometre an hour straight freeway. It's about people crashing in corners or run-off road type crashes, which in right-hand corners involves running off the road into whatever infrastructure is on the left, but on left-hand corners often involves going onto the incorrect side of the road and having an impact with an oncoming vehicle. There's a broader community discussion around speed limits. I mean, up until, you might say, well, 40k school zones, they've been around now for about 40 years. Changes to urban speed limits. So people are understanding now that, 50 and even 40 are more appropriate speed in urban areas. And the last point I made there is, the country environment has changed. It's changed when I first started riding motorcycles 40 years ago. There's vineyards, ice cream parlours, rural 5-metre blocks. There's so many driveways and intersections on our rural road network. Enough on speed. I'm going to move on now to safer roads. Okay. So I do have quite a few pictures here. I'm just going to touch on a few of these, and again, these are just some examples, but to get people thinking about. A couple of reports I will highlight. So that Austroads report of 2016, it's 200 pages long. If people are involved here in road safety and infrastructure, you really need to know. I'd like to tell people to carry that almost as a reference guide. Again, it's 200 pages of information about all the things you can do to make the road network safer for motorcyclists. And this is still 9 years later, held up as a best practice guide, not only in Australia, globally. People reference this in Europe. And more recently, the National Asset Centre of Excellence, if you're not sure what NACO stands for, the report authored by David Milling in Brisbane and his team about the science and the data about what difference the installation of guardrail makes to low radius curved corners. And this is the European report that was mentioned in my introduction. So this was commissioned by FEMA's our European equivalent, so the Federation of European Motorcyclist Associations, and the Swedish organisation, but supported by IRAP in 2003, developed this guide, Safer Roads for Motorcyclists, and it includes information from across the whole world. So there's reports on what's being done in terms of infrastructure improvements for many, many countries. So that's available freely online as well. So I'm sure we're all familiar with what you call an underrun motorcycle protection system, rub rail as a brand. So people are familiar with this. The system designed to prevent serious injuries in the event of people making a low side crash and sliding into the upright posts of the W-beam fence. Okay, so that's fantastic. But here we've got a picture, so this is a downhill, left-hand corner. You can tell by the guardrail that when this photo was taken, that was a pretty new fence installation. So where was the engineer involved, or the many engineers involved in this installation saying, hang on, we need to make sure we have motorcycle underrun on this system? Well, this one. So here we've had, again, a well-meaning design crew here when they've installed I'm pretty certain, the newer W-beam on the inside of the corner. So in this case, they've gone, yes, we must make sure we specify W-beam there. And this is the way that different government systems and programs work. But meanwhile, the existing piece of W-beam on the outside of the corner, that is where the motorcycle riders end up when they have the low side crashes, not protected. And for added points, we've even got the chevron post on the inside of the W-beam fence. So this is me. So I'm a qualified road safety auditor, so this is another element of it. And there's been some developments in looking at touring routes and looking at history crashes. And if you look, and some of you in this room, again, I know there are many in different areas that are more across the science and the data of this than I. But when you look at a motorcycle, a touring route, that the crashes won't happen. You look at a 50 kilometre section of road, over a 10-year period, the crashes aren't going to be evenly spread across all the corners. You're going to finish up with clusters. That just many study or examination of accident data rather shows this. And so motorcycle-focused safety audits can look at, well, so what are the elements? Why is it that riders are crashing or running off the road on these particular corners? So here's an example. So, we all know what a pothole looks like. But this one is right over the crest of this hill. So that is, I'll go back. So that's our pothole. So on this case, our well-trained rider, as he's approaching the crest of the hill, notwithstanding that it's a left-hand corner, potentially riding on the left-hand track to buffer away from oncoming traffic that he can't see over the crest of the hill, and arrives to find that pothole. How about this one? Is anybody shocked to see that on the road network? So some of these photos I took, my photo of the missing underrun on the new fence was from Tasmania 15 years ago. This picture I took 5 kilometres away from my house last Thursday in Gippsland in Victoria. Now, this is interesting. And the question I ask is, how long till this be repaired? And I know there's a trial going on. It's mentioned in the pre-routing document of the trial being done on the Dargo Road in Victoria about greater intervention on motorcycle roads. Now, this is actually, you can see it's got the paint marks on it, so it's been identified and marked for repair. So my question is how long it's going to be repaired. But the story I want to tell about this photo is, you ride along here in a motorcycle in the daytime, of course you can see that. But if you come along that big long straight stretch of road before that at night time, which is about 2 or 3 kilometres long, the thing you're actually looking for is wombats and kangaroos on the side of the road. You're unlikely to see that. If there's a car coming the other way, there's headlights showing, you're absolutely not going to see that. You hit that wrong, at the wrong angle, even 100 kilometre an hour speed zone, even if you're doing 80 k's at night, hit that and crash, land awkwardly, potentially a fatal crash. Now, coming back to, I talked about workplace health and safety. I'm going to make an analogy back here to that as well. With workplace health and safety, you assess likelihood versus outcome. And that's how you make your assessment on how to treat something. The likelihood of what I just described happening to a motorcycle rider, I might nearly describe as minuscule. The chances of what I just described happening are pretty remote between now and when that gets repaired. But if it did occur, the result would be catastrophic, quite likely to result in a death. So in a workplace safety perspective, and this road didn't develop like this overnight either, did it? It's taken, there's many weeks of truck running over there that's led to that rutting. But to my mind, this is something that can't sit there for a month or 2 months to be repaired. It'll probably be repaired within a month maybe. But that risk of a fatal crash to a motorcycle rider exists the entire time. There's no signage warning about uneven road surface because of that one either, by the way. Here's 2 of my favourite pictures. A few of you in the room have seen this one because I've used it before. At the end of COVID in Victoria, this is Latrobe Street in Melbourne. In putting in place some safe cycling infrastructure. So in Latrobe Street, there were two lanes going downhill towards Docklands from the city. So the left-hand traffic lane was removed and replaced with a bicycle lane. And I don't think anybody needs me to explain what my concern is with this photo. So they put in rigid delineation posts between a cycling lane and a traffic lane. I pointed out to people, this is a downhill section of road. A person could go down that cycling lane at 40 kilometres an hour easily. The motorcyclist or a cyclist impacts with those sorts of barriers at 40 kilometres an hour or more, likely to be a fatal outcome. So again, like one of my earlier questions, so all the work that was put into deciding to put in this cycle lane, the design of the cycle lane, the many people who are involved, signing off, doing the specifications about how is all this going to happen, not one person apparently said, hang on, they're not the right posts to be putting in. Not these days, not when we have the safe system for all road users. Still there. Yeah, I sound a bit passionate about some of this stuff. I am. All right, so here's a few elements that I've touched on in the presentation about safer roads. I'm going to move on to the next one though. And I'll introduce by saying this. So I went to a launch of, it might have been the first rub rail installation in Tasmania with the Transport Minister there nearly 20 years ago. I thought, what am I going to say at this launch? What am I going to say? It might have been the first thing I did with the media, it certainly was with that minister. But I came up with a line that I've actually used many times since, and I'll share it with you today. That was, talked about, said, this rub rail, it's great. Safe infrastructure is good, well thought out, strategic location, that's fantastic. But for the motorcycle rider, the better thing is not to crash. The safe system, particularly around safe infrastructure and even the technology on motorcycles that's limited compared to what you can do in a car, those elements of the system can only protect you so much. Safe people is an element of the safe system. And for motorcyclists, I think it's a neglected element. And again, people largely think it in terms of speed compliance and enforcement and the like. But, so let's look at some elements of the safe people. So rider training. So a picture here from one of the heart training centres. There's been a few references to MotoCap already. And as was mentioned by Bernard, so the development of the Good Gear Guide in 2009, which I touched on one of my earlier slides, so that was funded through a grant program from the federal government to the Australian Motorcycle Council, with the work then done by Dr. Derome, and it's great to see you here, Liz. And as Bernard said, we see this as the forerunner to the MotoCap program. That is a program that educates, provides information where people can go and learn and find out about what is good gear for different circumstances, and also looking at whether you're riding largely in urban areas or for country areas. So I highly commend people find the MotoCap website. Police enforcement is an interesting one. Because we hear about, so this is a program 1 year before the MotoGP. So motorcyclists and policing and enforcement have a bit of a bad history, you might say. And unfortunately, if we have issues, and there's a lot in Victoria at the moment, it's interesting to see those numbers in New South Wales lower for unregistered and the like. In Victoria, it's actually going the other way. So people are unregistered motorcycles, stolen motorcycles, that's another one, a few of those things happening. So when Victoria Police go, so we're going to focus on motorcycle riders before the World Superbikes, the reaction from the motorcycle community is all negative. And I say to people, these people on unregistered motorcycles doing extreme high speeds on stolen motorcycles, they're not your friends as motorcyclists, let me assure you. In Tasmania, when some of those programs, when it launched the campaigns rather, and I'm not sure what happens in New South Wales, when we did a couple of these campaigns in Tasmania, I was president of the Tasmania Motorcycle Council then. The TMC, in fact, did it jointly. We stood alongside the Traffic Assistant Commissioner, and the motorcycle group gave the message to the media that we think what the police are doing is a great thing. Marketing and advertising campaigns, that's another one. So it's trying to work out what the effect and measure the effectiveness. I know it's difficult. So this is from a program that was run in South Australia a few years ago. Federally, I'd spoken to Senator Carol Brown, had been the Assistant Minister for Roads and Infrastructure up until the middle of last year. And I know the federal government haven't done much in the way of advertising campaigns really in the last 20 or so years. But in these days of social media, of course, so even what comes out of today's forum, it'll get shared across social media across the whole country and indeed overseas. So our national organisation, we sort of sometimes think, well, look, maybe there is some value in some national campaigns. And after 20 years of the feds having done nothing, with an increase in level crossing crashes, some of you might recall seeing in the middle of last year a national television advertising campaign about railway crossing safety. Well, I'm going to say to whoever finishes up being the minister after this Saturday's election, well, the number of motorcycle deaths in Australia was 278 last year. It's the highest in 35 years. Let's have a motorcycle safety national advertising and awareness campaign. Awareness of other road users, that's purposely vague because it cuts both ways. So this is a still shot off a GoPro from myself out doing a motorcycle safety audit. So the challenge is for riders, for a rider on a road like this, to be aware that when you're going through a corner, there may be... So I say to some people, say to some of my friends, if you want to go riding quick on a country road, whatever you might define quick as, that's okay, but always bear this in mind. There could be somebody coming the other way in a car doing just the same as you are. So you've got to ride that you never know what's going to be coming the other way. But it cuts both ways too. How do we educate car drivers, motorists, to know that that's not a safe thing to be doing on a windy country road? My next GoPro shot was taken about 3 minutes later. I don't have the yellow circled picture. You can't quite see what that is though. That's a deer, which is nearly the same colour as the trees and the vegetation. So people might look at this and say, well, look at that road. What kind of 100 kilometre an hour speed limit, what kind of speed might riders travel down that road at? I say to people, it's great up in the high country. This is up in the high country, up past Omeo. I love it up there. I live in Gippsland. You've got to be, these people talk about kangaroos, these deers. Oof, they are, yeah. So again, this is for awareness of riders. It's great going out riding on these fun motorcycle roads. And I don't know how much data is available on impacts with animals, but and I know I saw one only recently. It was this state or another. Only in the last week or so, somebody had died with an impact with a kangaroo. So there's a few headlines under Safe for People. I've purposely not talked about rider training because I know we've got a session on that later in the day. The last point I put there though is about some emerging issues. So the gig economy is one, and as the Minister said, she was asked about it on the radio this morning, we know it's not everything, it's only a small part of it, but it is part of why there's been this increase in motorcycle use in Australia over the past 3 or 4 years. In terms of outliers, again, it's interesting to see that the non-compliance and the unregistered vehicle, etc. in New South Wales is in decline. Another emerging issue, which I hadn't put on there though, is this rise in e-bikes and e-scooters. And you see it all the time in the media when people are pulled up on one of these high output bicycles. It's almost like the police, and this is fine, but the police media release is saying to them, this is not a bicycle. And that's right, it's not a bicycle, because it doesn't meet the requirements of being a bicycle, therefore by default or by definition, it's a motorcycle. And it's a two-wheeled problem, and it's a transport problem for all of us, but powerful e-bikes and e-scooters aren't motorcycles either. And I think it's an emerging issue within the crash statistics for the whole country about how these things actually. I'm not using to try and diffuse the number and say it is a problem, but I just wonder whether e-bikes and e-scooters in urban areas, about what actually is the quantity of fatalities and serious injuries and how much we actually know about it. And I will just touch briefly on post response and care, and then I'm just about done. But look, these are important emerging things. I know of, so 2 very good friends of mine both lost their lives on winding country roads in Tasmania. One was many years ago, so before any of this sort of e-technology was found. Was come about. So Rowan, who was about in his late 20s, so Rowan wasn't found for 4 days, so a fatal crash. And another good friend of mine ran off the road, crashed on his own in a bush area, and he wasn't found until the next day. So this sort of emerging thing about what's happening with whether it be the iPhone or the crash alert coming out of motorcycles, it's something that doesn't get discussed a lot. And going back to my introduction to the safe road users, the better thing for the motorcycle rider is not to crash, absolutely. But in the event of motorcycle riders crashing, particularly in these regional, remote, bush type areas, these are very important elements. And I've put this up as a bit of a summary. So whilst things may not have been not perfect, and there have been some improvements, there are things that can be done better. The reality is that substantial improvements have come about in motorcycle safety in Australia over the past 20 years, but the progress has stalled, and that's the problem. In fact, it's worse. And so I was going to say earlier, that people know that definition of doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Well, in fact, for motorcycle safety, doing the same thing with improvements, continual improvements, for 20 or more years had been working. But for the last 3 years, we've been doing the same thing with improvements and getting better, but we've been getting these worse results. So that really does lead us to why we've got the challenge here. And again, thank you, Minister, and to the government for the opportunity to speak. Thank you, everybody.